Saren Alder hated men in suits, and she hated boardrooms even more. So sitting across from a glass table in the coldest corner office she'd ever entered, with her spine locked straight and her jaw so tight she could feel the ache in her temples, she knew she was exactly where she did not belong. The skyline of downtown Chicago stretched behind the man across from her, a curtain of gleaming ambition. But it was the man himself who stole all the air from the room. Lucan Hale, billionaire CEO of Hale Corp. Built his empire from scratch, they said. Though anyone in design knew he didn't build, he bought. A face that magazines called impossibly sculpted and staff whispered about like a ghost story. Brilliant, brutal, untouchable. He was reviewing her file not with curiosity, but with that slow, dissecting coldness of a surgeon before an incision. He hadn't offered her coffee. He hadn't stood when she entered. He hadn't even said her name. "You were supposed to sign the acquisition papers last week," he said without looking up. Seren crossed her legs carefully, keeping her voice steady. "I didn't sign because I'm not selling my studio. We had a verbal agreement with your real estate team that the design district would remain intact. You broke that, so I pulled out." Lucan finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, nearly colorless, and entirely unreadable. "There was no contract. Verbal agreements are meaningless. You know that." "I know that I built that space from nothing," she said. "I've mentored 20 young designers there. That building isn't just walls. It's people. It's community." Lucan blinked once, then leaned back, steepling his fingers like a man preparing a verdict. "It's a corner block worth $32 million, surrounded by 9 other parcels I already own. Your community is obstructing my redevelopment plan, and now you're costing me time." "Then sue me," Seren said flatly. "You've done worse." He didn't flinch. "I don't want to sue you." "No?" Her eyebrows lifted. "What do you want then?" For the first time he smiled. But it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a signal, like a chess player moving his queen halfway across the board. "I want you to marry me." There was a pause. A long, stunned, almost comical silence. Seren laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You're not serious." Lucan pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it toward her. She didn't touch it, but she could see the front page. Legal draft. Contractual union proposal. Her name printed clearly at the top. He went on, voice calm, clipped, measured. "I'm in the middle of finalizing a multi-billion-dollar merger with a legacy family-owned lifestyle brand. Their board wants stability, authenticity, a family-oriented figurehead who can represent long-term trust. I've been advised, strongly advised, that my single status is a liability. That combined with the media fallout from my previous relationship makes me a risk. I need a wife, temporary, clean, someone with a reputation for integrity, artistic credibility, and zero tabloid presence." Her lips parted. "You want to marry me to clean up your image?" "I want to marry you because you're already in a losing position and have something I need," he said. "And I'm offering something you need." She stared at him, disgust and disbelief mingling in her gut. "You think offering to buy me in a different way makes it better?" "I think," he said, "you are not the type to be bought. That's why this works. People will believe it. You're not glamorous. You're respected. You'll look reluctant enough to sell the narrative." "I am reluctant," she snapped. He nodded. "Good. That helps." Seren stood, heart pounding. "You're insane." Lucan didn't argue. He simply said, "You have 48 hours. If you accept, your studio stays open. I'll restore the grant program you used to run, fund it anonymously, and keep my people out of the district. You'll maintain your independence. We'll sign a non-disclosure, and after 1 year, we dissolve the marriage. Quietly. You walk away with everything intact." She wanted to throw the folder back in his face. She wanted to curse him, storm out, never see him again. But she didn't move. Because in that moment, all the numbers were real. She had 6 weeks before the eviction order was final. Her students had nowhere else to go. Her grant had been gutted last year, and her appeal was still pending. If she walked away, she'd lose everything. And not because she'd made a mistake, but because someone like Lucan Hale didn't care what her work meant. Her voice was quieter when she finally spoke. "And if I say no?" Lucan stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Then I finish the buyout. Demolish the block, build my towers, and in 2 years, no one remembers your name. Seren looked down at the folder. She didn't touch it. But the lines on the page felt like they'd already wrapped around her wrists. I'll need legal counsel, she said. Of course, Lucan replied. I'll need boundaries. I'd expect them. I won't live in your home. That's negotiable. She met his eyes. This doesn't make you decent. I'm not decent, he said. I'm efficient. When she left his office, the sun had dipped behind the buildings, casting the city in silver and blue. She felt nothing walking down the elevator, nothing stepping into the street. But by the time she reached the corner, she realized her hands were shaking. She didn't know it yet, but she had just stepped into a game far more dangerous than anything in the boardroom. And the man who thought he could control the outcome was about to find out that not every contract ends the way it's written. The courthouse was nearly empty when Serene signed the marriage license. No grand ceremony, no champagne, no flowers, vows, or lingering glances, just ink on paper and a pen that felt heavier than any she'd held before. It was a Thursday morning, early enough that the Chicago air still held a bite, and the clerk barely looked up from his desk as he handed them the final copy. Lucan stood beside her in his signature charcoal suit, crisp to the point of being inhuman. The sleeves tailored to a precision that said he didn't sweat, didn't stumble, didn't surrender. He didn't look at her when he took his copy of the license. He didn't even offer a hand. Seren had spent the previous 48 hours reading the contract line by line. She hadn't slept. Cleo, her best friend and lawyer, had begged her to walk away, told her the whole thing reeked of control, of power imbalance, of psychological warfare dressed as business. Seren didn't disagree. But logic was a luxury, and hers had run dry when her students started asking where they were supposed to go after the building closed. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival, for her work, for her people, for everything she'd built that Lucan Hale had casually listed under the term obstruction. The contract, to its credit, was clear. They would live separately. She would attend 3 public events per month with him. She would accompany him on 1 business trip every quarter. They would not share financial assets. They would not share bedrooms. They would not share anything, really, beyond the illusion of unity. Public affection, if necessary, would be negotiated in advance. All press inquiries would be handled through Hale Corp's PR division. In return, she would receive a legally binding agreement exempting her studio and the district from corporate acquisition for a minimum of 5 years, along with a full restoration of the grant that had previously been defunded. Everything had a number. Everything had a cost. Even her name. After the paperwork was done, Lucan turned to her, expression unreadable. We'll have lunch. Then the first photo. She blinked. Today. There's no reason to delay. We're already married. The narrative starts now. Seren followed him outside where a black car was waiting. A driver in a dark cap opened the door without a word. The inside smelled like leather and absence. Lucan didn't speak as they drove. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, trying to make sense of this man who had rewritten the trajectory of her life with the same detachment someone might apply to a spreadsheet. He finally spoke as the car pulled into a small private garage beneath a high-end restaurant she didn't recognize. You'll be photographed leaving the building with me. You don't have to smile. You do have to look like you chose this. I didn't, she muttered. He turned to face her fully. No, but you agreed to it. That's what matters. Inside the restaurant, everything shimmered with expensive subtlety. No loud colors, no logos, just textures that whispered about wealth instead of shouting it. The host didn't ask for their names. They were led immediately to a table at the back near a frosted glass window. Cameras flashed outside as they passed. Paparazzi, just as he'd warned. Lucan took his seat across from her with surgical precision and ordered 2 glasses of Bordeaux without asking if she drank wine. She didn't bother correcting him. There were bigger battles to fight. This doesn't have to be unpleasant, he said after a moment, unfolding his napkin. We can keep it clean, professional, uncomplicated. Seren rested her elbows on the table, eyes narrow. You forced me into a marriage to protect your public image. I don't think we're anywhere near uncomplicated. Lucan's voice was steady without offense. I didn't force you. I presented an option in a situation where you had limited ones. You made the decision. No, she said. I made a sacrifice. There's a difference. He was quiet for a beat. You're right. That surprised her more than anything else so far. Their lunch was quiet, almost eerie in its civility. The waiters didn't hover, clearly trained for high-profile clients. The food was immaculate, though Seren could barely taste anything. Her nerves hummed beneath the surface like a current. She hated the performance. She hated the way he barely looked at her, as if she were an actor filling a role he'd already scripted in his mind. But most of all, she hated how effective he was, how everything about him was calculated, practiced, perfect. After the meal, they exited through the front door, just as the cameras had anticipated. Lucan reached for her hand. She hesitated, then gave it. His grip was warm but impersonal, fingers locking around hers like a clasp. Cameras fired. Reporters shouted. She smiled, not for them, not for him, but because it was the only defense she had left. Back in the car, he let go of her hand the moment the door closed. The mask dropped instantly. No pretense, no warmth. "You'll receive a media schedule by tomorrow," he said, "and your studio documents are being transferred to your attorney's office as we speak." She looked out the window, Chicago sliding by like a city she no longer belonged to. "Do you ever get tired of orchestrating everything?" He paused. "Well, no. Control is the only constant in my life. When you stop expecting anything to go the way it should, you learn to control the variables that matter. And people are just variables to you." He didn't answer. Back at her apartment, she stepped out of the car before he could open his mouth again. She didn't say goodbye. He didn't try to follow. She walked up the stairs alone, unlocked her door, and stood inside the hallway for several minutes, just breathing. Her name was now attached to his, her freedom bought with a signature. Her days no longer her own. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. If Lucan Hale thought she would simply fade into the script he'd written for her, he had no idea who he just married. Because Seren Alder didn't survive by being controlled. She survived by learning the rules better than the people who wrote them, and then using those rules to burn the whole damn system down. It had been 6 days since the courthouse wedding, and Seren had yet to see Lucan again in person. She had attended one scheduled event, an arts gala at a refurbished museum Lucan's company had poured millions into restoring. They arrived separately, as prearranged. Lucan greeted her with a practiced smile in front of the flashing cameras and handed her a flute of sparkling cider, not champagne, which told her he had at least read her dietary preferences from the brief Cleo had sent. They exchanged no more than 20 words the entire night, all of them public, polite, and painfully hollow. By the time she returned to her apartment, she felt as if she'd gone through a 12-hour shoot for a movie she didn't believe in. The next morning, her studio was quiet when she unlocked the front door. A new keycard installed as part of the security upgrades Lucan's team had insisted upon. Her assistant, Rhea, was already there, organizing supply orders and sorting through internship applications. Rhea was 24, whip-smart, and observant in a way that often made Seren both proud and nervous. "You didn't post anything from the gala," Rhea said, glancing up from her laptop. "Everyone's wondering if it was staged." Seren dropped her bag beside the old drafting table. "It was. You don't deny it anymore." "I'm too tired to pretend," she said. "The whole thing's a circus." "And you're what? His unwilling ringmaster?" Seren shot her a look. Rhea raised both hands. "Sorry, that was too sharp." "No," Seren said. "It was accurate." She spent the rest of the day submerged in work. Her hands in clay, her mind in measurements, her entire body engaged in the process of building something that belonged entirely to her. That was how she reset. She didn't do yoga or meditate or drink overpriced tea. She shaped, carved, bent, and smoothed. She lost herself in form and shadow and touch until she could forget the weight of the ring on her finger. She hadn't taken it off, not yet. Not because she wanted to keep it, but because it was a reminder of the deal she'd made and what it was costing her. It wasn't until after 8 p.m., when the last of her interns had gone home and Rhea had locked up the front, that Seren noticed the man standing in the far corner of the studio. She froze mid-step. He was watching her, silently, patiently, with his hands in his coat pockets and the kind of stillness that felt deliberate, sculpted. "Lucan, you're not supposed to be here," she said, brushing dust from her forearms. "I gave my name at the door. They let me in." "You own the door," she snapped. "They're paid to let you in." He didn't move closer. "I wanted to see the place, the real version, not the photos in the file." Congratulations. You've seen it. He looked around slowly. There were sketches pinned to the walls, half-finished sculptures under plastic, the scent of plaster and earth in the air. His gaze landed on the massive steel framework in the center of the room, her latest installation, meant to be suspended in the atrium of a community center downtown. A structure composed of fragmented human silhouettes, cut from raw metal, shaped like bodies caught mid-motion. "What's it called?" he asked. "Fracture." He nodded. "It's intense. It's real." They stood in silence, the weight of the unfinished work pressing down between them. Seren crossed her arms, waiting for him to get to whatever reason he had for appearing without notice. Lucan finally spoke. "I've been told I don't ask questions," he said, "that I issue commands and expect them to be obeyed. That sounds accurate. I don't like people in my space. I don't like unpredictability. But I realize you're not interested in what I like." She tilted her head. "And yet here you are." Lucan took a step forward. Not threatening, just closer. "I'm not used to feeling unsure. You unsettle me, Seren. You don't try to impress me. You don't want anything from me." "That's because you took the only thing I wanted," she said. "My freedom, my control. I gave you your studio. At a price." "Yes," he admitted, "because I knew you wouldn't accept charity. You would have walked away on principle and let yourself burn. You don't know me." He didn't argue. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Not calculation, not arrogance, but recognition, and maybe regret. Lucan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square envelope. He placed it gently on the edge of her drafting table. "What is it?" she asked. "A gift. I don't want anything from you. Open it when I'm gone." She didn't move, didn't touch it. He gave her a final look, then turned and left without another word. The door clicked behind him, the sound louder in the quiet of the room than it should have been. Seren stared at the envelope for several minutes before she finally walked over and picked it up. It wasn't heavy. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No branding, no header, just 2 lines, handwritten in careful, straight strokes. "For 6 weeks of your time, no questions asked. The Fracture project is fully funded. No press, no credit, no interference." Seren sank into her chair, heart thudding. It was what she'd tried to get through 3 city council meetings, what she'd written grant applications for, what she'd fought and failed to push through on her own. Now somehow, it was hers. Clean, anonymous, but not free. Nothing from Lucan Hale ever was. She looked up at the sculpture. The pieces still disjointed, still suspended in motion, and she whispered more to herself than the room, "What are you doing, Lucan?" Because whatever game he was playing, the rules were starting to shift, and she wasn't sure anymore which of them was in control. The following week unfolded like a slow, disorienting shift in gravity. Seren continued working in her studio as if nothing had changed, but something had. Lucan's unexpected visit lingered in her mind like a song she didn't like, but couldn't stop hearing. She caught herself glancing at the steel envelope more than once, rereading the note just to be sure she hadn't misunderstood it. The funding for the Fracture project had arrived, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or interference, exactly as promised. The grant account had no sender name, but the timing, the amount, and the phrasing left no doubt. It was him. The man who had forced her into a marriage for optics, now backing her most personal work in total anonymity. It didn't add up. Men like Lucan Hale didn't do things without conditions. And yet, there had been no follow-up, no demand for recognition, no appearance at the studio, just silence. That silence broke 4 days later when Seren received an invitation, hand-delivered by a courier dressed like he worked for the White House instead of a corporate PR firm. The envelope was dark navy, the lettering embossed in silver. Inside, an invitation to the Hale Foundation's annual midwinter gala. Formal dress, black tie. Attendance strongly encouraged for all Hale Corp affiliates and representatives. The implication was clear. As Lucan's wife, she was now expected to be seen. Again. Another evening of staged smiles, rehearsed body language, and eyes watching for cracks in the facade. She almost threw it out, almost called Cleo and told her to draft an exit clause. But instead she stuffed the card into her drawer, shut it with a little more force than necessary, and went back to her work. 2 days later, Rhea returned from lunch with wide eyes and a smirk that practically vibrated. "Okay, don't freak out," she said, breathless. "But Luke and Hale is downstairs." Surin didn't look up from her sketch. "He's probably here to inspect the sprinkler system." "No," Rhea whispered, leaning in. "He brought lunch." Surin's pencil paused midline. "You're joking." "He's standing in the front lobby with a bag from Marcelli's. The guy everyone says he hasn't set foot in public without a driver or a bodyguard since 2018. He's just standing there." Surin stood slowly, smoothing the front of her shirt more out of habit than vanity. She made her way downstairs, each step a strange mix of dread and curiosity. And sure enough, there he was. Luke and Hale, in a dark coat and tailored slacks, holding a brown paper bag in one hand and a white envelope in the other, as if he had no idea how absurd he looked. "I thought I said no surprises," she said flatly. "You said no ownership," he replied, unbothered. "Not no lunch. Is this another PR stunt?" "No cameras," he said. "No agenda. Just food." She eyed the bag warily. "And the envelope?" "Business," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a single contract amendment, a clause that removed 3 upcoming appearances from her schedule. No catch, no fine print. Her eyes flicked up to him. "Why?" "Because I read the notes from your meeting last week. You're behind on your fabrication deadlines. Your crew lost a supplier. I assume you'd rather spend the time finishing your installation than making fake conversation at charity functions." "You're adjusting my contract out of kindness?" she asked, suspicious. He shrugged. "Out of logic. You shine when you're left alone. I need you rested and publicly impressive when it counts. Not burnt out on empty rooms." She hated how much sense it made, and how closely he must have been paying attention to know those details at all. "I'm not eating with you," she said, arms crossed. "I didn't ask you to." He placed the bag on the table beside her and nodded. "Enjoy." He turned and walked out, just like that. No parting line, no smirk. Just quiet efficiency, like he had simply completed a task on his list. Saren stared after him for several seconds before pulling the bag open. Inside was a container of handmade spinach pasta and warm bread from the exact restaurant she'd once mentioned in passing to Cleo as her comfort food. She hadn't said it in front of him, which meant someone else told him, or he asked. Later that evening, she found herself walking alone through the city. She did that sometimes when her head was full. Chicago at night was a different city, harsher, colder, but honest. Wind pulled at her coat, and headlights swept through puddles on the pavement. But she kept walking, no destination in mind. Just steps, movement, breath. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. Unknown number. "Gala is Saturday. Wear black if you want to match. Don't wear black if you want to make them talk. Either way, you win." She didn't respond. But when Saturday came, she did wear black. Not to match him. Not to please anyone. But because it made her feel powerful. Sharp, untouchable. The dress was simple, but the lines were clean, the cut daring, and the expression on her face when she walked into the ballroom was the kind that silenced a room before anyone spoke. Lucan saw her before she saw him. He was already standing near the bar, nodding to someone in a navy tuxedo. But the moment Seren stepped into the room, his gaze locked on her like a tether. She didn't look away. She walked straight past a half-dozen donors and 3 photographers and stopped in front of him, her hand resting lightly on the stem of a champagne flute. "I'm not going to pretend we're in love," she said, low enough for only him to hear. Lucan's lips twitched. "Good. I hate pretending. And don't touch me unless I touch you first." He nodded. "Fair. And if anyone asks how we met, I'll say you bought me." He leaned in slightly. "Then I'll say you charge more than anyone ever has." They stood there like that for another moment, a storm of meaning under the stillness. Then calmly, Lucan turned toward the room, held out his arm like the perfect gentleman, and waited. Saren hesitated, then slid her hand through his elbow and walked forward into the storm. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But when the cameras flashed, the crowd leaned in, and the whispers began to rise. It wasn't because they looked happy. It was because they looked like the kind of people who could burn a world down and walk away clean. The week after the gala unfolded with an unsettling stillness, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Saren had expected that evening to drain her completely, another performance in a long list of carefully choreographed lies. Instead, she had left with her pulse steady, her mind sharp, and a strange ache behind her ribs she couldn't quite name. Lucan had kept his distance throughout the event, just enough to look married, just enough to keep up appearances, but never once had he pushed, prodded, or performed beyond what was necessary. For once, he hadn't tried to dominate the room, and it was that restraint that unnerved her the most. She returned to her studio the next morning to find a new delivery in the corner of her workspace, a set of industrial-grade power tools, high-end, the exact model she had complained about not affording 2 weeks ago. No note, no label, but she knew it was him. Rhea spotted them first and gave Seren a look loaded with questions she didn't feel like answering. So she just said, "They're donations. Let's not ask too many questions." Lucan didn't contact her again until Friday. The message came through her assistant, as always, requesting her presence at a private dinner with a visiting executive from Norway, whose company was entering a joint venture with Halecorp. It was one of the few events marked as mandatory in her contract, but unlike the others, this one would be small, private, and without cameras. Just business. Rhea offered to go in her place, joking that no one would notice the difference if she borrowed Seren's shoes and put on a poker face. Seren didn't laugh. She said she'd go, but her voice lacked conviction. That night, she dressed in something deliberately simple. Black slacks, a cream silk blouse, a coat that fell past her knees. Her makeup was minimal, her hair in a loose bun. She looked polished but not styled. She arrived at the private restaurant 20 minutes early, which she hated. Lucan was already there. He was seated at a small circular table in a curtained room set apart from the rest of the venue. The space was minimal, intimate, and dimly lit, with no music, only the hush of conversation from distant rooms. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. He didn't smile, didn't offer a compliment, but he did pull out her chair for her, a gesture that felt oddly genuine. "The other guest had to cancel," he said as she sat. "Their flight was grounded in Reykjavik." "So I'm the substitute," she said dryly. "You're the only one I wanted here." She didn't answer. A server arrived to pour wine. Lucan didn't order for her. He didn't even suggest anything. He waited until she made her choice, then made his. It was the first time she noticed how careful he was when things weren't scripted, how silent he became when the world wasn't watching. She realized he only ever filled space when he was on stage. "Why did you really marry me?" she asked once the first course arrived. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out like a splinter working its way to the surface. Lucan set down his glass, meeting her eyes directly. "Because I couldn't think of anyone else who wouldn't be afraid of me." The answer stunned her more than she expected. She blinked, then sat back slightly. "You think I'm not afraid of you?" "I think you're afraid of needing people." "Not of me." Her appetite vanished. She took a sip of wine, letting the silence stretch. "You manipulate everything. You don't know how to exist without control." "I know," he said, with no attempt to defend himself. "That's the only reason I've survived this long." She stared at him, searching for something beyond the armor. "And what happens when you can't control me?" Lucan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Then maybe I learned something for once." The rest of the meal passed without tension, but without ease either. They spoke about art, about architecture, about Icelandic geothermal engineering, topics that felt almost neutral, but beneath them all pulsed something heavier. He asked her about the materials she used, not in a way that sounded polite, but as if he was genuinely interested in why she preferred concrete to marble, steel to bronze. She explained carefully that she liked the rawness of it, the resistance. She liked that her work didn't pretend to be timeless. It cracked, it rusted, it bent to the elements. She said, "You can't love something if it can't break." He didn't say anything for several minutes after that. When the check came, he paid with a metal card that looked like it weighed more than her whole wallet. As they stepped outside into the cold, she turned toward the curb where her driver was already waiting. Lucan said, "I'll walk you to the car." She let him. At the door, she hesitated. Something sat between them like an unspoken sentence. Then she asked, "What would you have done if I'd said no?" "To the marriage?" She nodded. He looked her directly in the eyes. "I would have ruined you." She didn't flinch. "At least you're honest." "And now?" He tilted his head slightly, watching her with something that almost resembled regret. "I think," he said slowly, "I would have regretted it more than you ever could have." She didn't reply. She got into the car, but as it pulled away, she looked back. Lucan was still standing there in the dark, hands in his pockets, staring at nothing. And for the first time since this strange arrangement had begun, Seren didn't know whether she wanted to run from him or toward him. That terrified her more than anything he'd ever said. Seren woke the next morning with a heaviness she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't exhaustion. She had actually slept for once. A full night uninterrupted by deadlines or imagined arguments with Lucan, replaying in her head. But something deeper had settled beneath her skin, a dull ache that made her feel like her bones were full of questions. She sat at her kitchen counter with her coffee going cold in her hands, her eyes staring out the window without seeing the street below. For weeks, she had been telling herself this arrangement with Lucan was transactional, clinical, a decision made out of necessity, and yet, slowly, insidiously, that foundation had started to fracture. Not because he had changed, but because he hadn't. He was still Lucan, controlled, calculating, careful to the point of suffocation. But there were moments now, rare and quiet, where she caught something raw beneath the surface. A hesitation, a pause before he spoke. The way his eyes lingered on her, not out of ownership, but as if memorizing something he didn't want to lose. She hated that she noticed. She hated that it mattered. She tried to push it out of her mind and threw herself into her work. The final stretch of the fracture project was underway, and the deadline loomed like a second spine behind her back. Her team moved quickly around her studio, cutting metal, reinforcing steel supports, adjusting the frame of the center suspension where the final piece, a fragmented torso cast in tinted glass, would hang. Seren had designed the installation as a story told in negative space, each shape incomplete on its own, each form twisted in conflict. But when seen from the right angle, they converged to make something whole. It was her most ambitious piece to date, and the one she had buried the most truth inside. That afternoon, in the middle of heat welding a base plate, she got a text. It wasn't from Lucan. It was from Cleo. "Cleo, he called me. Personally, hail. Wanted to know if you were okay. Didn't ask about the project. Didn't mention the contract. Just asked if you were eating." Seren read the message twice. Then again. Lucan had never contacted Cleo directly before, always routing everything through assistants or his legal team. The idea that he had gone out of his way to check on her, that he had bypassed protocol, Lucan Hale, king of protocol, left her throat dry. She responded quickly, not wanting to invite more speculation. "Seren, I'm fine. Probably just a strategy to check the stability of the asset." But she knew that wasn't true. The next day, she found herself walking into Hale Corp Tower unannounced. She told herself it was to clarify the next two scheduled appearances and request a revised timeline. She didn't need to make an appointment. She had clearance now. The security guard at the lobby desk recognized her and immediately called upstairs. His voice on the phone was crisp, deferential. "Mrs. Hale is here." The words still startled her. Lucan's office was on the top floor, of course. She took the elevator alone, surrounded by reflective glass and quiet instrumental music that felt more like surveillance than ambiance. When the doors opened, his assistant greeted her politely and said, "He's free. You can go in." No questions. No delay. As if he had been waiting for her. She stepped inside and found him by the window, as always, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city. He didn't turn right away. "You're not on my calendar," he said. "I'm not here for business." That made him turn, slowly, carefully. He looked tired, though it was the kind of tired that didn't manifest in sagging shoulders or disheveled clothing. No, Lucan looked tired the way skyscrapers do after storms. Still upright, still unshaken, but somehow older. His suit was perfect, his tie centered, but his eyes were not guarded the way they usually were. "I wanted to know why you called Cleo," Seren said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He didn't deny it. He simply answered, "Because I haven't heard from you in 4 days, and I knew you'd answer her before you'd answer me. That's not part of the agreement." "Neither is missing you," he said quietly. The words dropped between them like a live wire. She stared at him, unable to respond. Lucan walked to the table and picked up a folder, handed it to her without ceremony. The amended appearance schedule. I removed the investor dinner. You looked miserable at the last one. She took it, though her hands felt slightly numb. You keep making decisions for me. I keep trying to make things easier for you. But you never ask what I actually want. I'm asking now. Silence stretched like a taut thread. She sat in the chair across from his desk and set the folder aside. I want to know who you are when no one's watching, she said. Lucan didn't sit. He stood there like a question mark. She pressed on. I want to know what makes you afraid. What keeps you up at night? What you regret? His jaw shifted, but he didn't look away. I regret not being kind to my brother before he died. Seren blinked. I didn't know you had a brother. I don't anymore. The admission was simple, unadorned. He moved to the edge of the desk, leaned back slightly, his posture less rigid than usual. His name was Mathis, younger than me by 5 years, smarter in some ways, softer in all the ways that mattered. He worked for a nonprofit I tried to buy once. We fought a lot. He hated the way I ran the company. He thought I should walk away from all of it. And I told him if he didn't understand what it meant to build something like this, then he didn't deserve to be part of it. He paused. His voice didn't shake, but it dipped, like someone stepping into cold water. He died in a car accident 3 days after our last conversation. I was supposed to call him that morning. I didn't. Seren didn't speak. She let the weight of the moment settle. Lucan looked at her then. You wanted to know what keeps me up? It's that. It's the silence that comes after you run out of time. She stood slowly, crossed the space between them. She didn't touch him, not yet, but she stood close enough for him to feel her breath. I don't want to be another regret, she said. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked completely unguarded, like the man he might have been before the contracts and the empire and the armor. When he opened them again, she was still there, steady, waiting. He reached out, not to possess, not to claim, but to ask. She didn't pull away, and for the first time, they weren't husband and wife by design. They were two people in the same room, finally starting to feel what had been building since the first line of the contract was signed. The quiet, dangerous truth that love was never part of the agreement, but it was starting to rewrite everything. The air had changed between them, though neither of them admitted it out loud. Seren could feel it in the quiet way Lucan looked at her now, not with the guarded calculation of a man protecting his assets, but with the cautious reverence of someone handling something they no longer believed they deserved. In the days that followed their conversation in his office, he didn't bombard her with texts or invitations. There were no new contract revisions, no carefully curated appearances. He let her breathe. And it was that absence of pressure, that sudden respect for space, that made her more aware of him than ever. She poured herself into finishing the fracture installation. The final piece, a suspended glass form that reflected fragmented silhouettes, was due to be installed in the atrium of the new Southside Arts Center, a community-funded initiative that had been on the brink of cancellation until Lucan had stepped in, again silently. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't even mentioned it. But somewhere along the line, he had started watching her not as a means to an end, but as something he wanted to protect. That scared her. The night before the installation, she stayed late in the studio. Rhea had gone home hours earlier, and the rest of the team had left after loading the last of the components onto the truck. Seren stood in the middle of the empty space, staring at the shadow the sculpture had left on the wall. It looked like an echo, like a memory of something no longer there. She didn't notice Lucan until she turned to lock up and saw him leaning against the doorframe. Hands in his pockets, hair a little windswept, his coat open like he'd come straight from the street without stopping to fix himself. You're not supposed to be here, she said, echoing the first words she'd spoken to him weeks ago when he had entered her studio unannounced. He shrugged lightly. I missed my window, didn't I? I wanted to see it before you moved it. It's gone, she said. Truck left an hour ago. I'm still glad I came, he said, and the way he said it made something in her chest twist. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes steady on his. You're doing it again. What? Looking at me like I'm going to disappear. His voice was low. Aren't you? She stopped a few feet in front of him. I don't know. He let the silence settle between them. Then with a steadiness that startled her, he said, I made the wrong deal. When I wrote that contract, I was trying to buy an alibi. Someone clean, respected, unattached, someone who wouldn't need anything from me except what I could give on paper. But I underestimated how much space you'd take up just by being honest. You never played the part. You never made it easy. I wasn't supposed to, she said. I know. But somewhere between pretending and protecting my image, I started hoping you'd stay even after the expiration date. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw something stripped of arrogance. He wasn't trying to convince her. He wasn't selling a narrative. He was standing there uncertain, with his hands open in a way she'd never seen. You think hope is enough? She asked. No, he said quietly. But it's the first thing I've felt in years that wasn't engineered. She stepped forward slowly until they were just a breath apart. Lucan, what we built, this arrangement, it wasn't made for permanence. It was designed to be temporary, strategic, clean. And now? He asked. She reached up and touched the lapel of his coat, her fingers resting lightly over the fabric. Now it's a mess, but maybe it's ours. He didn't kiss her. He didn't rush. He simply leaned his forehead against hers and let out a slow, uneven breath, like someone exhaling after being underwater too long. Later that night, she didn't go home. She went with him. Not because she had to, not because it was expected, but because she wanted to see what it felt like to be close to someone who no longer wanted to win, only to stay. He let her into his penthouse the way someone opens a door to a room they've never allowed anyone to enter. The place was cold, beautiful, sterile, floor-to-ceiling glass, steel fixtures, everything in shades of gray and white. But beneath the design was something else. A man who had built walls not to impress, but to survive. She could see it now. In the absence of warmth, in the quiet precision of every surface, in the untouched bookshelf with titles about efficiency and legacy, but nothing about stories or softness. She walked into his space like she belonged there and set her coat on the arm of the couch. He didn't ask her what she wanted. He didn't make a move. He waited, so she moved first. She reached for his hand, threaded her fingers through his and led him to the center of the room. Tell me something no one else knows, she said. He looked at her, surprised, almost shy, then said, I used to sketch buildings when I couldn't sleep. As a kid, I wanted to be an architect, but my father said it was a waste of numbers. Do you still draw? No, he said, but I still see the world that way. She squeezed his hand. Then you already understand me better than anyone else ever did. And when he kissed her that night, it wasn't powerful or possessive. It was hesitant, like he was asking a question with his mouth and bracing for the answer. She answered him with silence, with breath, with the press of her body against his. There were no cameras, no contract, no schedule. Just a man and a woman who had begun in deception and now stood stripped of all performance, with nothing left between them but the possibility of something real. Neither of them said the word love, but both of them knew it was the only thing that hadn't been written in the agreement, and the only thing that would last once everything else expired. The wind shifted in early March, not just in the air but in the rhythm of Serene's days, in the way her feet touched the ground, in how her thoughts no longer braced for impact the moment she opened her eyes each morning. Something had changed, tangibly, irreversibly, and though it hadn't been declared with vows or headlines or public spectacle, it had embedded itself in the quiet spaces between her and Lucan. The contract was still in effect on paper, yes, but it had ceased to govern them. It had become little more than a footnote in a story that had rewritten itself entirely. Serene's installation at the Southside Arts Center opened to the public under cloudy skies and an overwhelming turnout. What was meant to be a modest community unveiling turned into a citywide event after a surprise feature in the Tribune caught national attention. The write-up wasn't about Lucan. His name wasn't even mentioned. It was about her, the architect who turned fracture into form, the sculptor who made brokenness sacred. There were photos of the installation at dusk. The light refracted through the suspended glass figure, shards of metal casting shadows on the atrium like dancing ghosts. People stood in silence beneath it, many with hands on their hearts, some with tears on their cheeks. For the first time in years, Serene felt what it meant to be truly seen, and what it meant for her work to speak louder than her name. Lucan arrived late, wearing no tie, his coat open, hair windswept and slightly undone in a way that would have driven his PR team mad. He stood at the back, away from the cameras, and didn't say a word. Not to the mayor, not to the reporters, only to her. When she walked up to him after the speeches were over and the crowd had thinned, he didn't greet her like a husband or a sponsor or a man who once claimed her with a contract. He just said, "You built something they'll remember." She replied, "So did you. You just didn't know it." They left quietly, walking side by side down the block toward a quiet cafe she loved. He didn't take her hand, and she didn't offer it, but the closeness between them made such gestures unnecessary. Their silence was not distance anymore. It was intimacy. A week later, Lucan called for a private meeting with his board of directors. Surin didn't attend, but she knew what it was about. He stepped down as CEO of Halecorp that day. Not with a scandal or disgrace, not with a resignation forced by politics, but with the calm, considered finality of a man who had built his legacy and now chose to step out of its shadow. He didn't announce it to the press. He didn't orchestrate a narrative. He simply passed the position to his second-in-command and left the building that had once defined his every waking moment. That night, he returned to the studio, not to her apartment, not to the tower, but to the place where they had first faced each other as adversaries. He stood in the middle of the workspace with his coat still on, his hands at his sides. She didn't ask why he was there. She just walked up and pressed her forehead gently to his chest. "You finally let go," she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her and whispered back, "Because I finally had something worth holding instead." They burned the contract on the roof of her building the next morning. It was symbolic more than necessary. The legal agreement had already been nullified days ago, signed and sealed by both parties with no press and no witnesses. But she had asked for something real, something ritualistic. So they stood together under the pale light of early spring, the city yawning awake beneath them, and set the pages aflame. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening until only ash remained. Carried away in a breeze neither of them tried to chase. They didn't remarry, not in the way people expected. There was no second ceremony, no white dress, no guest list. But months later, they moved into a converted train depot just outside the city, half studio, half home, with tall windows and raw brick walls and a kitchen where he learned to burn pancakes, and she pretended not to care. He built things now. Not empires, but furniture. Tables, frames, things with weight and grain. She teased him about his measuring tape obsession. He teased her about leaving clay fingerprints on every surface. They still fought, sometimes with the same ferocity that first defined them, but their fights ended with hands on cheeks and truth in eyes. Not one of their arguments had ever ended in silence again. One evening, while unpacking boxes in their shared office, Lucan found the original contract, her copy, folded and shoved into an old sketchbook. He didn't show it to her, just held it for a long moment, reading the fine print, the conditions, the clauses they had once clung to as if they could control what was coming. He set it on the desk, found a pen, and under the final clause, Clause 9, terms of expiration, he wrote in his sharp, mechanical handwriting, "Expired, rewritten by choice." Seren walked in, saw it, and said nothing. She picked up the pen, added a small flourish beside his note, and closed the book. They didn't need titles, or rules, or scripted affection. They had something rarer, harder to define. A relationship born not from romance, but resistance. From a contract that tried to bind them and failed, and from the freedom they had discovered when the contract no longer mattered. Lucan still looked at her like she might vanish. Seren still built her world with space for solitude, but neither of them left. Neither of them needed to run anymore. And maybe that was love, the kind neither of them had believed in, yet both had somehow found. Not because they chased it, but because they finally stopped running from themselves.